In the new year. The bill is SB 465, and I see the author is here. Welcome, Senator Huff. And we'll start with roll call.
Hancock?
Well, you know, here.
Hancock here. Walters here. Desaulniers? Here. Desaulniers here. Liu? Here. Liu here. Strickland? Here. Strickland here.
We good?
Mr. Huff? Yeah.
Well, members, I'll try to make the most of my one shot with the one bill we have here. But I'm very pleased to present today the Voter Identification Act. It begins to address a long-held problem with California's balloting system. I'd first like to make clear it's not a partisan issue, but rather a democratic one, and that's democratic with a small d. Across California's diverse population and political landscape, voter identification requirements receive wide support. In fact, 70% of Californians support the idea, and I believe you should have a handout indicating that on a poll just done in 2009. And it's not only Republicans who've sought to make this a reality. In fact, then State Senator Diane Watson, now Congresswoman from Los Angeles and ranked as the most liberal member of Congress, once carried this very legislation, which was voted out of this committee and out of this House 34-0. The Commission on Federal Election Reform in 2005, a bipartisan commission headed by President Jimmy Carter and Secretary of State James Baker, also included a recommendation to require voters to present a photo ID card at the polls. Today, there are 25 states that require voters to show some form of ID before voting. Moreover, the bipartisan U.S. Commission on Civil Rights recommends that states require photo identification not just before voting, as this bill requests, but also before registering to vote. SB 465 is therefore a modest proposal by the Commission on Civil Rights Standards. The Commission stated that, quote, voter fraud and voter intimidation disenfranchise voters and weaken our political system, end quote. I believe there are two very important elements of the electoral process in a society with universal suffrage: accessibility and accuracy. Polls must be accessible to all who desire to vote, and the tabulated votes must accurately represent those who voted and how they voted. No one of these should be held in higher regard than the other. Otherwise, we are failing the people. SB 465 strikes this delicate balance. By requiring voters to show identification at the polls, it ensures voters are who they say they are, yet it does not sacrifice accessibility while doing it. The two need not be mutually exclusive. As we've seen in the past, it's all too easy for ineligible voters to vote. For example, a post-election investigation by the Secretary of State, the same Secretary of State who supports this legislation, for the 1996 congressional race in Orange County found that 490 foreign citizens were registered to vote, and of these, 303 actually voted in the election. Bob Dornan lost the election to Loretta Sanchez by only 979 votes. According to John Fund, for the same election, an investigation by the Immigration and Naturalization Service revealed that 4,023 illegal voters possibly cast votes in the disputed election. In 1999, 60 Minutes found people in California using mail-in forms to register fictitious people or pets and then obtaining ballots in their names. That same program reported that the illegal immigrant who assassinated the Mexican presidential candidate Luis Donaldo Colosio was registered to vote in San Pedro, California, twice. In the 2002 race for California's 30th Assembly District, a survey was commissioned to 1,691 individuals who registered for the first time in that election. It was found that at least 76 people were not citizens but still voted, and 49 indicated they were not registered at their correct residence. Moreover, in a telephone survey of an additional 1,117 newly registered individuals, it was discovered that 223 voters didn't live at the address where they had registered, and 69 admitted to voting twice. The race was won only by 266 votes. So for the committee analysis to state, as it does, that the committee is unaware of any evidence that voter fraud of this kind has been occurring in California, doesn't quite cut the mustard. To say you're unaware of something does not mean it doesn't exist. In actuality, the evidence out there is very accessible and would cause alarm to any voting citizen. But voter ID goes far beyond just citing specific examples of fraud. It is also about maintaining integrity at the ballot box. We have an obligation to ensure Californians trust the electoral process and trust that their vote will count. They must be able to know that their vote will not be denied by illegally cast votes. As noted in the Supreme Court majority decision in Crawford versus Marion County Board Board of Elections. A voter ID law is justified in order to ensure the integrity and reliability of the electoral process. In other words, it assures legitimacy of the electoral process, and therefore the legitimacy of government. The minor inconvenience of presenting a photo ID at the polls is well worth the increased voter confidence that will accompany it. The right to vote in free and fair elections is a highly valued fundamental right that sets the United States apart from many other countries. The time-honored principle of one man, one vote in our nation was intended to ensure that the will of the citizens is expressed through the democratically elected representatives. Unfortunately, California's election system lacks the appropriate protections for voter fraud to ensure these principles are upheld. SB 465 establishes the necessary safeguards for voters and keeps the ballot box accessible to all. Once again, we cannot sacrifice legitimacy or accessibility. Both are essential to democracy. Jimmy Carter, Diane Watson, and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission are right. We need to require identification at the ballot box. I ask for your aye vote.
Speakers in support of the bill?
Yeah, Madam Chair, members, David Wolf here with the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, and we're in support of SB 465. Members, simply put, you need proof of identity now to do a lot of things. You need proof of identity to get a library card. I went into Best Buy last week to buy something and was required to present identification for my purchase, along with my credit card. So, members, if I had to show identity for these things, how much more important is it to show ID in order to participate in the fundamental activity that makes America a democracy? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the right to vote. Frankly, unless you're a non-citizen, parolee, or a minor, you really should have nothing to fear in this process of being asked to present ID before you vote. And for these reasons, we'd ask for an aye vote. Thank you.
Are there other witnesses in support? Witnesses in opposition? Seeing and hearing none. Oh, witnesses in opposition, sorry.
They were being very quiet. They're all from Orange County.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman and committee members. My name is Tiffany Mock with the ACLU, and we oppose SB 465 because it makes it more difficult for eligible voters to vote. SB 465 would be one of the most restrictive voter ID requirements in the nation. This legislation would disproportionately impact the elderly, the working poor, and racial minorities who statistically are less likely to have these forms of identification. In addition, there seems to be little evidence of voter impersonation as opposed to perhaps mail ballots, which was noted, and illegal registrations. And in that case, we don't see much reason for having this legislation. For those reasons, we oppose SB 465.
Sure.
Yes, you can.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question. If the ACLU is against the voter identification showing for voting, would they come out against the practices going on right now in every airport asking for IDs from every citizen that goes on an airplane?
I can't speak on that specific issue as I only deal with state issues and the IDs for national.
Would you support a piece of legislation in California come out proactively asking that all California airports are barred from showing identification in airports?
I think we already show identification.
No, that's my. If there was a bill that said we believe that this is not in violation of personal rights to show the identification, as what was stated, would you also then, therefore, if that's the case on voting, is that the case for showing an ID at an airport? Would you have that same stance on a state bill that did the same thing, taking out voting and replace it into going on an airplane?
As a legislative advocate on state issues, I can't speak on that, given that our policy.
That's a state policy. I'm asking a question on state policy.
I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Okay. I can find out for you if you.
Thank you.
Like.
I would like to know that answer.
Okay.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, I'm Trudy Schaefer, representing the League of Women Voters of California, and we also must oppose SB 465. We, of course, all recognize that voting is a fundamental citizen right, and it is very important that we protect that right and make sure that we do not discourage eligible voters from exercising that right. And I also cannot speak for how my national organization would answer your question, Senator Strickland, but I would point out that traveling on an airplane is not of the same stature of a citizen right as our most fundamental right of voting. The previous speaker mentioned the kinds of people who would be most at risk of being discriminated against by this kind of requirement, and that is one of the major reasons why we consider this a burden that should not be applied. It's not only a burden to the person who has to have, or if he or she does not have at the time of voting, a government-issued photo ID would have to be able to get to one in 5 days, and have the burden of, in some cases, as the analysis points out, several hours of travel, at least the burden of the fact that offices are not open as much now at this time, and it could be a significant burden. It's also possibly a privacy issue in that there would have to be the recording on the roster of the identification number of something that is not required, for example, by the HAVA requirement for a first-time registrant. There's also, and our letter pointed out, the concern of the burden on elections offices that are already processing, in some counties, thousands of vote-by-mail ballots and provisional ballots, and for something that we do not believe satisfies a need that exists, we just don't see that that should be done. Overall, we feel that it's very important that we encourage informed and active participation in government and that we protect our rights to vote, and we don't feel that this is the answer to that kind of need. Thank you.
Mr. Strickland.
Thank you. I understand. I accept that you said that it's a more important right to vote, and I concur with you. But you did say in your statement that it's discrimination to ask for ID. So would you say it's a discriminatory act to ask for someone's ID as they walk onto an airplane?
I think I've explained why I don't know enough about that. I'm focusing on...
I understand that, but your statement said that it was discriminatory to ask for someone's ID to vote. Would you therefore say it's discriminatory to ask for someone's ID to walk on an airplane?
I don't think that we're talking about the same thing in terms of discrimination. You're talking about a situation within someone's private life. I'm talking about a right of citizenship, and for that reason, I think that I need to look at what the impact is on us as citizens in this case, and I don't think I can speak to your question.
Other witnesses?
Margaret Johnson with Disability Rights California, and I agree with what the previous speakers said, and in addition just want to point out that often people with disabilities don't have all the requisite ID either. It'd be a burden on them to try and produce that, and if they were to vote provisionally and have 5 days in which to then go out and produce the ID, that's also very burdensome in terms of many people with disabilities having access to transportation and being able to get the identification produced. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. Ignacio Hernandez on behalf of the Dolores Huerta Foundation, which is a civil rights organization based here in California. We are also opposed to the legislation for a number of reasons. Voting, really you should look at this bill in the context of the history of protecting the right to vote. The one person, one vote has been an ongoing battle. Though it was guaranteed for a small percentage of the population, it has been generations that we have been trying to actually deliver that promise, and we've yet to achieve that goal. And so you have to look at that bill in that context. When we have a population that's been identified through studies that do not have a driver's license, going out and getting a driver's license in order to vote, that is essentially requiring them to pay a fee to vote. If they had no other desire, no other need to get a driver's license, and the only reason why they need it is to vote, then that in and of itself is essentially could be looked at as a poll tax, which we have been fighting in the courts for generations. So I think the question, very interesting question posed by Senator Strickland of whether it's where our position would be in terms of licenses or IDs for airplanes. It is different, not just on a fundamental kind of layman's approach, but in the legal context. context, it's significantly different, because what we're talking about is constitutional protection in terms of voting, and we're talking about generations of legal cases and case law to protect individuals when they're trying to vote. So the presentation of the ID in and of itself on the surface seems not to be, too much of a problem, but when you're actually requiring someone to go out and pay a fee simply to vote, then that opens the door to a number of other legal challenges, and I think that's where this bill, just that one part of the bill, is probably enough to defeat this. I think you also have to look at the types of voter intimidation in California and other states, but in particular in California that we've had, and the efforts that we have taken to try to protect voters and those, especially those naturalized citizens who are trying to vote. It has been extremely problematic in California. This opens up the door to those types of voter intimidation practices. And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned the Carter Commission and recommendations. That recommendation was not isolated. It came in a larger context of reforms, many of which have not been adopted in California. So before we talk about this proposal and use the words the Carter-Baker Commission, we need to talk about some of the other reforms that have not yet been adopted in California. Let me just close by saying how disappointed and troubled I am by this bill, because just 2 years ago we tried to pass a very small bill after the voter intimidation in Orange County, again trying to intimidate naturalized citizens. We could not even get a unanimous vote in this legislature on a bill that would simply notify candidates about the rules and laws against voter intimidation. We had to get that out barely on a majority vote, and it got vetoed. And we couldn't even get, and so then to come back with this kind of a bill and not talk about the larger concern of voter intimidation in California, I think we just can't have that discussion. So I think for that reason, this bill is premature. If we're going to talk about the larger context and make sure that all of our folks vote, no matter whether naturalized citizens, no matter where they live, then let's have that discussion. But otherwise, it's premature. I'm available for questions.
Santosh Ram Santana with Asian Americans for Civil Rights and Equality, and we're opposed to the bill. Thanks.
Thank you.
Madam Chair and members, Vanessa Hina on behalf of the California Immigrant Policy Center here in opposition.
Thank you.
Madam Chair and Committee, I'm Pete Martineau with AARP, and we're in opposition to the bill.
Thank you. Are there others in opposition? Seeing and hearing none, are there any comments or questions from members of the committee? Mr. DeSaulnier?
I just wanted to be clear, Senator Huff, the Secretary of State was the previous Secretary of State on the previous legislation.
That is correct. It's not the current Secretary of State, but it is
the
one that had to wrestle with the recount in the
Never trust congressional candidates.
Yeah. Are there any other
Speak from experience?
questions? Mr. Strickland.
Senator, I don't know if you know the answer to this or not, but it's a good question. The gentleman talked about the poll tax. My understanding is you're willing to take any form of photo identification, and it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that you can get a California state ID for free. Is that the case?
I believe for the those that are economically challenged, $6 is the fee, unless there's something else I've missed. Yeah, $6. Okay.
Thank you. So yes, the answer is there.
I just want to make a quick comment, and I just want to thank Senator Huff for bringing this bill forward. I mean, it is a very common sense piece of legislation. In today's society, you can't function without an ID, and I don't think it's a burden on a person to be able to show a form of ID in order to preserve and protect our electoral process. Again, you can't open a bank account. You can't get a book at a library. You can't charge on your credit card now without showing a form of ID, and that's just that's the nature of our society. My kids are in school, and they have student IDs. And so I just want to thank, again, Senator Huff for bringing this forward, and I think it's a very good piece of legislation, and my hope is that this committee will pass it out.
Okay, thank you, Senator Walters. The chair is not going to be voting for this bill, and I will explain why. In addition to the fact that voter impersonation has not been a documented problem, I am very concerned and believe our greatest problem is lack of participation, and particularly among people of color, some new immigrants, first-time voters, young voters. And there are many ways in which this bill will chill voter participation. Not only the intimidating mailings, which are still legal, but simply in a time when it's harder and harder to get poll workers, when long lines are a discouragement at the poll, and many of the young, the old and new voters may not be sophisticated in the vote by mail or permanent absentee, things that lengthen the lines, requiring discretion in deciding whether somebody's 10-year-old picture on their driver's license is in fact still them, can lead to difficult challenges for both poll workers and individuals. And going to the county registrar's office to provide proof is simply beyond many working people who do not have the time or the capacity to do that. And $6 may not seem like much of a fee, but if you're on public assistance or living on SSI or simply one of the working poor, it can make a difference between a meal for the kids and not. And that means something to me. So for those reasons, also, I am one of those people who I think would be disenfranchised unless I took some specific action. I am registered in a name by which I'm commonly known. On my driver's license, my name is Ilona Hancock. I don't know. It would be quite a hardship on me to become known as a different person for political reasons. I'm sure there are things like that that affect other people. But a major concern of mine also has been that it would impose a state-mandated local program. The bill says that reimbursement for those costs will be made if the State Mandates Commission finds that there are indeed costs. There would indeed be costs. And I think at a time when we are not rebuilding our infrastructure, when we are cutting back on programs that have held this state together and made it great, from education to environmental protections, this is not a time to divert one dime of revenue from the core programs of the state that meet documented needs. So, I will be voting no, Senator Huff, and I do hope that we can continue to work together on other ways to ensure increased voter participation and protection. I don't know if other members of the committee have any comments or if you'd like to close.
I would love to close it. There we go. Yeah, I'd love to close, Madam Chair. I'd like to address a few issues that were raised. One was that this would enact, if not the most strict, one of the strictest, voting requirements in the states. Actually, Indiana has the most onerous. And as you recall, I had this bill in another house in this around here a couple of years ago, and we were waiting for that Indiana decision. And the Supreme Court opined that it indeed was constitutional. And what they actually found out is that it didn't disenfranchise voters. In fact, the turnout increased after they enacted the most strict voting ID requirements in the nation. So, including Democrat voters, went up 8.32%. The overall turnout in Georgia, to address those that say that somehow it's going to be disenfranchising the minorities. The black share of statewide vote increased in Georgia from 25% in the 2004 election to 30% in the 2008 election when the photo ID was in effect. It does not. The data does not support disenfranchisement of the voters. Senator Strickland brought up the cost, $6. Okay, that can be a lot of money, but $6 when you're trying as a as a citizen of California to make sure whether it's the government programs you need or whatever sustain the people reflecting your ideology are elected, $6 is not a big deal to do for the benefits that come back from being a participating resident. Some other countries have much more stringent requirements than us. Mexico, for instance, not only requires a photo, it requires a signature and a thumbprint. Now, you want to talk about a strict voter ID requirement, go to Mexico. You won't be voting there. But, you know, it comes down to your constituents like this idea, and you representing them are going to turn it down today, if I'm surmising how this thing is going. And ultimately, you got to answer to them. 76%, I mean, how many times do we see polling like that on something from all walks of life, all parties? This is something the people want. We as legislators should be doing what we can to make sure our system is indemnified against fraud. Who's disenchanted if anybody can come up and say, oh, by the way, I'm Mimi Walters. Well, you don't look like Mimi Walters. Well, I am. Here's my signature. And you can vote, but you're not Mimi Walters. That is fraud, folks. And that's what we're trying to guide against with this legislation. Your people want it. You may not want it. But there again, you got to answer to that. I find it just, it's very frustrating, frankly. And I've had this thing before. We've tried to do a little more research on the thing and bring some compelling issues. But, you know, it is what it is at the end of the day. I would rather err on the side of making sure that everybody that votes, even if they have to pay a $6 fee for a photo ID, you know, does so. I was involved in an election the first time I was elected to City Council, 1995. I came in first out of 11. The second and third, after all the recounts and everything else, were dead tied. And that decision was decided by luck of the draw because that's the way the state constitution defaults it if you don't have something else, a local ordinance in place. So all it took was one fraudulent vote cast to determine the outcome of that election. That's not to say this deters fraud, but it's a tool to help make sure that those who are voting will actually be citizens. The data suggests, as in Indiana and Georgia, that when you enact photo ID that the people want, that it actually encourages voting because they have confidence in the system and they want to be counted. And for those reasons, and many more, I ask for your aye vote.
Okay, we'll take a vote. I would just observe for the record, official record, that the election in Indiana after this was enacted was the last presidential election, so there was unprecedented voter turnout. And we have to be careful about cause and effect analysis, I think.
They didn't go away.
Madam Secretary, would you read the roll?
Hancock?
No.
Hancock, no. Walters?
Aye.
Walters, aye. Desaulnier?
No.
Desaulnier, no. Lou? Lou, no. Strickland?
Aye.
Strickland, aye. It's 2-3.
Okay, 3-2.
Thank you.
Your bill. Okay,